Released in 2013, LEGO The Lord of the Rings pretty substantially missed the release of the Lord of the Rings movies. If you weren't there, they were a bit of a big deal. The third movie in the trilogy won Best Picture, something normally reserved for plodding dramas about rich people being sad, not Titanic action fantasy films. This game is not so subtly a tie-in to the Hobbit movies, the first of which released in 2012 and which was still ongoing at the time, which likely discouraged them from spoiling those movies by making a game about it, even though the book was already 100 years old. The Lord of the Rings also happens to be pretty perfect LEGO fodder. A gigantic cast with various abilities, gigantic set pieces, slower, more exploratory segments, and a lot of action. It's a no-brainer, besides the fact that the Lord of the Rings trilogy is one of the highest grossing movie franchises ever made. LEGO The Lord of the Rings covers the whole trilogy, the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King. Interestingly, taking after the extended cuts, including a few bits from those versions, even though the game itself is obviously abridged. As always, it's a LEGO game. We're pretty deep into this series now, so no big surprises. That means, of course, that this game is on everything. PC, PS3, Xbox 360, Wii. It somewhat interestingly misses the Wii U, which was apparently due to some issue with LEGO City Undercover getting it to run on the Wii U properly. And it has baby versions on the DS and 3DS with little fetal versions for mobile phones. While still largely typical, LEGO The Lord of the Rings separates itself in a few ways. It falls in line mostly with LEGO Batman 2, strong linear levels with short overworld segments between, this time pretty cleanly separated into about 10 districts that, while still part of the open world, are segmented off enough to make them satisfying to explore. Towns like Rivendell can be traversed in 2 minutes top, but are densely packed with collectibles, characters, and stuff to see. On that topic, collectibles have a few new facets. Quests are a big one, with characters in the overworld offering mithril bricks, this game's version of gold bricks is a sort of generic collectible, or red bricks for extras. All quests boil down to the same thing, get me X item. This ties into another collectible. Blacksmith blueprints, most of which are found in levels, although there are a couple in the overworld, and these feed back into basically everything. Mithril bricks are the currency for crafting items at the blacksmith to be turned in for quests, but these items can also be used by characters, in a really interesting twist on the character system I'll get to shortly. But the big takeaway is that everything ties into each other really cleanly, and working through the collectibles grind offers some permanent power-ups to the player in free play or the overworld, and that makes it feel worth it to engage with the collectibles beyond just number goes up. Another unique bit in the overworld is level selection. Beginning in the Two Towers, the party is split in two, with half of the levels following Sam, Frodo, and Gollum, while the other half follows pretty much everyone else. And beyond the unique gameplay for each party and levels, it gives the player some option to choose which order they play the levels in, running through all Sam and Frodo's until they hit a wall or alternating between the two, which admittedly doesn't matter all that much, but it's kinda neat structurally to give the player a little break from one side or the other. Very few characters in this game have fixed abilities. The only inherent abilities in the game are racial, tied to everyone of that group. Hobbits, dwarves, and Gollum can crawl through little doors, wizards can lift and arrange blocks. Not again. Elves have high jump and can walk on top of tight ropes and can swing on poles. Gollum can climb certain walls, and Uruk-hai have super strength, and all but the first two can be supplanted with items. Characters are instead differentiated by their equipment. Frodo has a sword, a file, and an elven cloak. Sam has a tinderbox, a frying pan, and a rope. Legolas has a bow and daggers, and so on. Puzzles in levels frequently center on retrieving new equipment, some of which becomes permanently added to a character's roster, keeping the game evolving as it goes on, which feels good. To quickly go through the various effects of items beyond the ones shared with traits, certain swords, primarily Aragorn's and Duril, can break Morgul blocks, files can light up dark areas, wizard staffs can as well, the elven cloak can make a character invisible, used in some stealth segments, the frying pan is used in a few context-sensitive sections to cook food, tinderboxes light fires, rope can be used to scale up cliffs or pull apart certain objects like the grapple from prior games, the fishing pole is used to fish, the bucket can carry water to put out fires, arrows are a long-range weapon but can also stick into holes in the walls to create poles to swing from, axes can smash cracked floors and walls, and bombs destroy silver blocks. It's a pretty standard suite of LEGO abilities, but the bow is a fun new addition that plays into the elves' mobility, and the bucket tends to have some decent puzzles built around it since it moderately limits what you're able to do. Although nothing here is earth-shattering, obviously. I mean, the axe is, but you know what I mean. Levels also get a few mix-ups. Again, existing in the bounds of what's been done before, but with some interesting things to note. For one, vehicle missions are completely dead, for pretty obvious reasons. There are a few sections that exist as short intros and outros where the player can move back and forth while being dragged along a linear path, running from something or controlling a horse or so on. But otherwise, levels are pretty straightforwardly tied to the core gameplay. Because of the structure of the movies, the game has some pretty hard delineation between levels as well. Frodo and Sam often have slower levels, exploratory, but also mixing in stealth on certain levels, which is definitely a new one for the series, and plays into the story really well. The mechanics of this are extremely simple, relying on being in some sort of hiding spot or being invisible at certain times. It's not Splinter Cell, but it works well enough for variety's sake. Meanwhile, Aragorn's party handles the set pieces in action, much more combat oriented and with less proper platforming or puzzles, although both do come up a few times in this game. The variety does a good job to keep the game interesting, not going too far in either direction so that the formula gets stale. Things haven't changed much for LEGO The Lord of the Rings visually in terms of raw graphics, being about on par with the last few as far as modeling and animations are concerned. Animation and models are cute but not stand out, levels have a lot of unique themes, and the lighting seems to be a touch better than it has been, with a lot of moments of playing with darkness, glowing light sources like lava and so on. But it does have some new directions thrown in that I really like. As opposed to LEGO Batman 2's mostly scale world with skyscrapers, the overworld in LEGO The Lord of the Rings is significantly scaled down in most areas. Saruman's tower in Isengard has gone from a skyscraper to a moderately large platforming segment. Same with Mount Doom, and the Black Gate is more like a moderately large fence. I could see this being off-putting for people wanting to explore Middle-earth, but I find it really adorable. It turns the overworld into a tiny little LEGO playset that captures the mood and landmarks of the areas without becoming an overwhelming mess. Plus it gives it a solid distinction from the levels itself, which, while also shrunken down, are much more accurate to the movies and nice looking in their own right. Cutscenes also take an interesting new direction. The voice game trend continues, but this is the first time we've seen it in a direct adaptation, and I think the solution is pretty clever, utilizing voice clips from the movie to recreate the story. This does have some issues. The way scenes are pulled off in a movie may obscure voices or change the volume, and while cutscenes are blocked and shot to match, there are some occasional issues with the cutscene sound. However, I think this solution both makes the cutscenes come off extremely well because of the extremely high production value for the voice acting quote unquote, which tell the story of the movies perfectly without issue and leave in some funny moments that were already there. But also, the style frees the cutscenes to return to small sight gags that the series was stronger at playing with anyway. Musically, the incredible score from The Lord of the Rings is used throughout. I mean, what do you want me to say? Each of the 3 movies in LEGO The Lord of the Rings comprises of 6 levels, and honestly pretty much everything is great. The variety is strong, like I said, for the constantly shifting perspectives, with a good blend of action, platforming, puzzles, and gimmicks. The Fellowship of the Ring hits all of the major set pieces, utilizing the overworld for the downtime. The prologue opens on the fall of Sauron. It's a gigantic battle loaded with guys running back and forth like a LEGO Star Wars 3 level that culminates in a fight with Sauron, who in this game is gigantic, more bionicle than LEGO, which is weird but also kind of fitting. And the fight actually kinda has mechanics. Sauron can only be damaged by baiting him into getting his mace stuck and shattering it with attacks after, which isn't much, but in a relative sense for this series is pretty fresh, as it keeps the focus on dodging attacks to make him vulnerable. This leads into a short platforming bit alongside Mount Doom, which is not only nice for the visuals and set piece flair, but for focusing so heavy on the platforming aspect for a little bit, with jumps over the lava and the like. The Black Rider is the first stealth mission of the game. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin are forced to crawl at all times and can't jump, only roll. This one is kinda lame. The game is slowed to a crawl, and the level is the bare basics of using the character's abilities to find rocks to distract the Nazgul repeatedly. It's kinda just a slog without much to grip onto. Weathertop is the first solid all-around level. The addition of Aragorn is nice because his sword is cool. Sometimes that's all you need. It's got a nice variety of stuff going on too, opening with a puzzle section, moving into some platforming, then falling into one of this game's oddest styles of gameplay. Perhaps the most intense asynchronous segment that the LEGO games have ever seen. One player is Frodo with the ring, completely invisible and divided from the rest of the party, and needs to break and build invisible objects for the others to fight off the Nazgul. It's a really creative way to implement the ring, and the player dealing with the Nazgul has some fun stuff to do, even if the Frodo player is not in quite as exciting a position. The Pass of Carados makes finding the character you want to pain. Frodo, Sam, Pippin, Merry, Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, Gandalf, and Boromir all at once is a lot. It's kinda cool to have the whole gang for a while, just seeing them all run around together, but it's a lot. The snowy mountains are a fun setting, and even if this level is the Gimli show, primarily focused on getting him past large snow drifts that the short guys can't get past, either by carrying or throwing him, and it's a fun and unique gimmick in general, to disadvantage a character and make the puzzle about getting them around. And being able to just throw Gimli around itself is kind of just a satisfying little thing to do. The Mines of Moria is set pieces all the way down. The cave troll boss works similarly to Sauron. Drawing its attention for long enough will cause it to go for a big slam attack, and doing this on certain marked spots on the floor gets it stuck. It's more involved than just mashing, pretty substantially so. The spots eventually get moved to harder to reach areas, so there's a little bit of exploration and puzzle solving under pressure if you're trying to keep your studs, and Legolas is needed to actually land hits. It's a boss so good it gets used again later, which is super surprising for this series. There's also a fun gimmick section where orcs are fought inside Gandalf's shield, a cool set piece on the collapsing bridge of course, and a simple but pretty cool looking QTE where Gandalf fights the Balrog as they fall, while everyone else does some fairly basic stuff to escape Moria. It's a lot going on for one level, and the set pieces make a nice, almost climax. Amon Hen repeats the invisible Frodo gimmick for most of its runtime. Frodo is completely separated off and dealing with Boromir. His section is entirely sectioned off from the main party, who have the more interesting characters and stuff going on, where Frodo is kind of just throwing rocks around. Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn get a series of puzzles to go through while waiting for Frodo before fighting a bunch of Uruk-hai. The fight against Lurtz, the big guy of the Uruk-hai, is a button masher boss mostly, which is a bit disappointing as a finale, but the bosses before this are good enough to make one that's less involved passable. The Fellowship of the Ring struggles the most in this game. It's the movie that has the least set pieces and action to adapt. It's a very tempered and comfy movie, with a few crazy sequences like Moria, which does leave this movie with the most levels that aren't very well suited to gameplay, although they do their best with the material. Outside of the Black Rider, I'd say all the levels are pretty good. But you can definitely feel it being stretched a little bit, and the highs here are strong enough that it doesn't matter. The Two Towers has a much easier time. There's a lot of set pieces, and even the slower parts have interesting variety in visuals and gameplay, as the Hobbits are separated from everyone else, and their levels serve as a bit of break between the big action-y explosions and whatever. In Taming Gollum, Gandalf has a solo fight with the Balrog. The visuals of the fight are cool, and reflecting the electricity back is a fun little mechanic that is really visually cool, but it's a lot of waiting and dodging to get to that point so that the game roughly lines up with what the Hobbits are doing. It's decently involved, but ultimately, since the lightning is just on a timer, it's not as fresh as the Troll. During all this, Sam and Frodo have a way less cool segment where they gather fish for Gollum, and then there's a fairly simple fight against him. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's certainly unbalanced for the player who ends up digging holes for fish. The Dead Marshes actually utilizes the stealth mechanic decently well. The path through the swamp is narrow, and Sam needs to continue carrying buckets of water through it, finding creative ways to get more or move it around. Periodically, between these sections, a flying Nazgul comes and nukes both players unless they hide. And while there isn't a ton of variety in it, Frodo cloaks up, Sam jumps in a tree trunk, it's kinda tense if you're trying to hold on to money, especially the first time when you're not quite expecting it. Trek Hobbit shifts the focus. The stuff with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli is whatever, but the stuff with Merry, Pippin, and the Ents is great. It's my favorite part of the movie. Controversial, I know. But getting to be the Ents, towering over ant-sized enemies, and smashing up buildings is so satisfying as a little power trip. Warg Attack is surprisingly small. The Wormtongue fight is really simplistic, and the fight against the Warg Riders is extremely straightforward. It's not bad, but it does feel more like filler than anything else in this movie. Helm's Deep obviously pulls off the big set piece thing very well. Gimli, Aragorn, and Legolas all have a lot to do. It's kinda surprising that it's not all combat focused, instead trying to get some more creative use out of the characters, like forcing Legolas to shoot enemies off their ladders or having Gimli knock the ladders down. The finale at Osgiliath is probably the game's strongest level, overall. Sam, Frodo, and Gollum are controlled by one player, while the other controls Faramir. Unlike the other asynchronous levels, both have a lot to do, and pretty seamlessly intertwine with each other. The little guys solve puzzles to progress forward, occasionally needing Faramir to shoot stuff with his bow to manipulate switches for them, scare off the Nazgul, or otherwise keep them moving, while their progress also opens up combat for him to get in place to help them out more. It's a cool dynamic that gives both parties enough to do while making them reliant on helping each other. Neither player really ends up standing around waiting for the most part, although it does occasionally kind of bump into that problem. And going through the level later can be made a little fresher by swapping who controls what set of characters. It's not a gigantic set piece level like Helm's Deep, but it's just a solid level with some fun ideas. Two Towers is good. Jumping between the various perspectives gives a good variety in gameplay, platforming, action set pieces, puzzles, and a lot of creative little ideas, like the Ant Rampage or the final level, which make it a strong set of levels overall with only one kind of dud, which itself is kind of just middling. It plays a lot with different modes of play in the same level and outside of it, that give every level a strong individuality that takes advantage of the game's enormous cast. Return of the King is much the same. Hobbit levels are slower affairs, and there's a lot of action on the other ends. Really no need to fluff about it. It's puzzles and atmosphere in the caves around Mordor, with a touch of platforming sprinkled in. It's got a good atmosphere and plays with shadows and lighting really well, but it's not a level with much going on beyond that. It's a nice little break from the action. The Past of the Dead is similarly cool and atmospheric, but focusing on the other party, which turns it into an action game. Aragorn's new sword gives him the role of killing the ghosts, while Gimli and Legolas are kept busy solving puzzles with their unique abilities to get Aragorn around. It's a solid, if mostly standard action level. Jumping back to the Hobbits and Cirith Ungol, Sam and some random orc fight Shelob, the giant spider. The curse of needing a potential second player, I suppose, since Frodo's out of commission. The fight is another pretty solid one, with one character needing to use a light source to stun the spider while the other goes in and stabs it. And the areas after, where Sam and Frodo collect orc armor to disguise themselves, have some fun puzzle ideas in a relatively open area. Jumping back again, the Battle of Pelennor Fields has the larger party fight the Witch King. The battle against the dragon creature is pretty fun. Its attacks need to be baited to get it to stun itself and open it for attacks, while the Witch King himself is a mini troll, fought in basically the same way, with attacks that are a little more dangerous to dodge because of the magic that chases the player down. Both are pretty standard bosses for the game, but the stage has cool visuals, and the fact that the bosses in this game are just better than the LEGO games typically have makes them stand out. And the ending with the giant war elephants being toppled by climbing up them with Legolas's arrows is a pretty good bit of spectacle too. The Black Gate isn't that different. The player fights several of the troll bosses with minor twists on how they get stuck and multiple of the dragons, but they need to be shot by Legolas to stun them first. The spectacle of the orc armies is good, and the visuals of Mount Doom looming in the distance are strong, but it does feel a little too similar to the prior level. The finale wraps things up very nicely. The journey up Mount Doom is great. Frodo is completely beat down, his jump height is reduced, and Sam spends most of the level babysitting him. It's admittedly a bit weaker for the Frodo player, but the platforming focus and the creative uses of the environment to get Frodo around when he's in this stunned state is a pretty cool twist on the formula. Plus, it's fun to come back to it in free play and completely break it. The final battle with Gollum puts a bit of a twist on Invisible Frodo, with him needing to throw Gollum around to open him up for Sam. It's a nice evolution of a mechanic that, while a neat way to adapt the ring, is usually pretty dull for the Frodo player. In this case, the Frodo player gets a little more to do, so it feels a little better. It's a solid ending, especially after how kind of standard most of Return of the King felt. Not bad standard, just if you've played a LEGO game, you kind of know what you're getting with this one. They didn't go crazy. Lastly, there's one bonus level again. This one, again, is LEGO City, but this time it's called Middle-earth, and surprisingly, this time it's pretty good. It takes the miniaturized version of the world as seen in the overworld to an extreme, with a very charming version of pretty much every location in the game, level, or overworlds, crushed into one medium-large map. There's extremely tiny versions of the Shire, extremely tiny versions of Isengard and Rivendell. The tower at Rivendell is maybe 2 times the size of your characters. It's very, very cute. Combine that with an abundance of studs, which keeps it from becoming a slog at the end, and I mean, it's really cute. While the LEGO cities have still long outstayed their welcome and their whole purpose has been completely replaced by the overworld, this is easily the least painful one that they've ever made, and it's by far the most visually interesting. The Lord of the Rings movies are kind of hard to talk about. They're so close to perfect that there's not a lot to say, honestly. For all 3, you can go and nitpick some places with dated special effects, but those are drowned out by incredible production design, wonderful practical effects, and genuine cinematic magic with stuff like the forced perspective that's used in virtually every scene, that perfectly sell the scale of characters of a variety of sizes. The cast is incredible, with the only questionable one anywhere being Katy Perry's husband. Each movie has something different it brings to the table, and they're just so fun, charming, and lovingly earnest, and surprisingly funny at times. The Fellowship of the Ring starts out so comfy. There's no better way to describe it. The atmosphere is light and fluffy, and it maintains that for a long time. Even as surprisingly scary threats like the Nazgul are introduced, and while it is light on action, what it does have with the still fantastic looking Balrog is great. The Two Towers is all in on action. You could uncharitably call a lot of the movie filler because there's a lot of politics, a lot of Frodo and Sam walking, a lot of action, but it's all so great. Gollum's development, his genuine struggle against his evil urges as he sort of befriends Frodo is great. The Battle of Helm's Deep is a flurry of fantastic action bits, and I love Merry and Pippin with the Ents. It's very silly and tangential, but the Ents are extremely funny. Merry and Pippin asking the Ents if they decided to help fight Saruman and getting told that the Ents have just finished saying good morning while it's visibly night. It's very funny. It's a very funny movie at times. And the Ents have a surprising sadness about them too that resonates with me. The variety of perspective lets the story play with a lot of themes, ideas, and styles, kind of like this game. It's fantastic. Return of the King succeeds on the back of Sam and Frodo. The other stuff is great too, the big battles are fun, but Sam and Frodo slowly sinking into despair, struggling with the weight of their burden to the point that at the end Frodo basically sails off to heaven with the elves to escape his PTSD, and of course like just the visuals of them climbing up there and the ending with Gollum, it's extremely emotional, and the movie is gorgeous, technically impressive, and still balances all the other elements. The humor, the action, the emotion. I don't know what to say. In short, all three of these movies are basically genuine masterpieces. I don't know what else to say. They're incredible. LEGO The Lord of the Rings is good. The levels have a freshness about them thanks to constant perspective switching, which offers a lot of gameplay variety. There's some clever ideas, bosses that are a bit more involved than usual, and lots of nice locations. The overworld is cute and simple, with a fun art style and relatively contained sections that make hunting collectibles down fun, and the cutscenes have a strong presentation thanks to using lines from the movie and focusing on sight gags instead, which makes it feel more like the LEGO Star Wars games than the last few have. While I don't think it's the strongest LEGO game, its overworld and LEGO City probably are, and I do like the item system turning any character into a god in eventuality as you collect more and more, plus the fact that collectibles have a tangible reward at all, outside of red bricks. Even if switching characters is usually more convenient than digging through the giant item menu. And the levels are solid enough, but I still do tend to lean towards LEGO Star Wars 3 for how clean it was. The fact that the story is so faithfully translated over is also cool. LEGO Indiana Jones 1 was barely comprehensible. Meanwhile, this can be a really fun way to re-experience the movies in a silly little simple game. It's a charming and enjoyable game overall, and there's not much else to say about it.